I set out from Fort Vancouver in the spring of 1849 with a small band of trappers bound for the cedar-fed streams east of the Columbia. We carried steel traps, percussion rifles, a brass compass, and enough salted pork to last a month. The fort rose behind us, palisades dark with tar, storehouses stacking beaver cloth and powder, while in front lay the mud road and the first cedars, dripping last winter into spring. We were 5 men and a French-Canadian guide, 2 pack horses, trap lines and furs lashed in canvas, and a hand-drawn map of the upper Lewis River that the fort clerk had scratched for us. I had counted every percussion cap and coil of snares twice before we left. Our purpose was plain. Run beaver where the river ran tight and slow, trade with Chinook middlemen where the channel swallowed itself, and return the pelts to the fort before the snows found the high ridges. Baptiste, our guide, read the map as if it were a ledger, naming bends and fords with a steady voice. By day, we navigated by the brass compass and sun sighting. At night, we set our position by the Columbia's channels, as remembered from the clerk's charts and the good sense of men who had known that river since before the Americans came. We carried a sextant only in name, an instrument of the surveyors at the fort, and used instead the angle of the sun and the moss on cedar trunks when clouds allowed. The country was all cedar and alder, the earth damp and fragrant with resin. Our horses moved slow through the mud, their flanks steamed each morning. We hung snares on alder branches and staked the iron traps in beaver runs, wading the shallow tailouts and feeling the slickness of silt underfoot. The sound of the river was constant, a low map for our progress. We slept with the pack horses hobbled close and our rifles within arm's reach. The salted pork tasted of smoke more than meat, but it kept. Each evening I took stock by lamplight, percussion caps counted into a tin, snares coiled neat, flints checked and oiled. The men worked without complaint, speaking little beyond the necessities of food, knot, and where to place the next trap. There were small human moments, Baptiste grinning when a beaver tail beat the water and the rest of us cursed our slow hands. Henri rubbing a blister while swearing softly, the furtive exchange of tobacco for a map mark from a Chinook trader who had come downriver to the fort before we left. It was from these traders that we first heard the odd cautions, not the tales of giants or of spirits in the proper manner of the old country, but hushed suggestions to keep fires high and dogs neither let loose nor left out. We took such words for the sort of superstitions that accompany every river and trailmen who make their living on waterways, learn to weigh warning against the weight of goods. By the 3rd night, those warnings were no longer a thing told in passing. We had bedded in a flat of cedar near a narrow oxbow. The horses were hobbled, the fire banked, low to keep smoke from drawing too much attention, the canvas tarpaulin set against a wind that tasted like coming rain. I had lain awake a long time, listening to the river and to the small sounds of men breathing when something began to move around our camp. At first, it was the soft scrape of feet on leaf and root, then a faint sniffing, like an animal hunting wind. Our dogs, kept quiet by command, lifted their heads and whined once and were still. A pack shifted, as if checked by a ghost. The hanging traps sang their faint metal with a sound that could almost be mistaken for the whisper of stream water. We probed with lantern and rifle butt and found no body, no head, no eye, only the work it had done. A snare, set the afternoon before, was bent to a half moon and its cord frayed as if by teeth. One of the iron traps lay on its side. The trigger pins sprung, but nothing within its jaws. The horses stood huddled and trembling. The trader's words returned to us, sharpened, and the camp fell into a mute understanding. We had come to call it the Stalker, not out of fancy, but because a name steadied conversation and gave our fear an edge to cut with. We did not speak of it aloud beyond the necessities, tightening snares, moving watch in turns. But the silence between us grew thick with plans and questions. At first light, we would push farther up the Lewis, following the map and the smell of cedar, but I counted my percussion caps once more and found my hands did not steady. The Stalker, whatever it was, had shown us it could take measure of our camp, and we had not yet taken measure of it. We fell into the timber as the river narrowed, packs settling into the familiar grind of leather and grease. Our compass needle wavered beneath cedar boughs. The sun was kept at a permanent half-light by the interlaced crowns. We travelled with the small rituals of men who have learned to measure distance by habit. The tightening of a saddle girth, the brushing clear of a tent flap, the counting of cartridge pouches at dusk. My rifle, a percussion long gun, rode in its scabbard a brace of percussion pistols, and a stock of round lead lay where I might take them in a hand. In the provisions we carried salted beef, hardtack, a keg of coffee, and a small reserve of pemmican for the poorer bowels of river and mountain. Our snares and spring traps were lashed to the packs, irons kept bright with bear grease. The Chinook who had pulled their canoe ashore gave us tobacco and words that stayed. They did not mock our ways. They spoke with the economy of people who trade in knowledge. A large thing moved high in the cedars, they said, and snares that had been set like teeth along the path were found unfastened in the morning or gone altogether. I recorded their warning on a margin of my journal and marked a line on our map upriver where salmon ran thick. We accepted their counsel, as traders do, and added a watch to our small designs. At our first camp, beneath a shelf of rock and a curtain of dripping moss, the forest altered its conversation. Birds fell silent as if someone had swept the air clean. The wind took on the heavy iron smell of old salmon left in a shallow pool. Even the horses stood with lowered heads. Men moved about in the half-light like things in a dream, mending snares, checking knots, murmuring names. Hale, who had trapped in Idaho some years, inspected each noose with an eye for the work of wolves or otter. He tightened snares that morning and cursed softly when a snaresman's wire had been broken where no toothmark lay. We found first the small things. A snaresman's cord, strung between two saplings, was uncoiled and gone, its knot untied, though the wire showed no cut. A jerkin of rabbit, hung upon a limb to keep it from scavengers, had been taken clean and without bite, as a careful hand might steal the heart of a sleeping man. Near a fallen cedar, we observed tufts of coarse hair caught high in a fork of bark, fur the colour of old riverweed. It was not the thin silk of marten, or the dense pelt of bear it lay in a manner that suggested the contact from above. That evening, we set our watches earlier than necessity required. Fires were banked low beneath tarpaulins. Men sat with their back to trees as much as to the flame, fingers loose upon triggers. The forest made small sounds, the scrape of squirrel claws, the plash of water over stone, the occasional crack of a limb releasing rainwater. Then came the other noises. The heavy snap of a branch high in the cedar crowns, as if a man had stepped upon it, the whisper of long limbs passing between trunks, an exhalation that might have been breath or the settling of the old wood. Our hounds went mute, even the tobacco smoke seemed to hold. Shortly after midnight, a commotion woke us. Horses stamped and a mule brayed. Hale was on his feet, rifle in hand, as a shadow moved above the tent line. Not the lithe lean of a man, but the weight of something that bent the boughs and let loose a rain of needles and a single, hard object that thudded into the earth with a sound like a hunted otter striking water. It was a salmon, whole and fresh, fallen from the heights as if carried and dropped. Men fired into the dark reflexively. A percussion cap cracked and echoed in the trees. Then again. No answering cry came down. We made no attempt to pursue. We had no notion of bringing such a thing to heel with lead and powder beneath cedar crowns 5 or 6 fathoms up. In the morning, we found more traces. Lines of sapling bark, rubbed bare at a height only a man might reach with an extended arm. Long parallel grooves along the trunk of a cedar where something had used a shoulder or a limb to climb. Paw prints there were not. The snares we inspected, our own and those left by others, were broken at the knot, as though untying were preferred to biting. The Chinooks spoke quietly amongst themselves, hands folded upon the knees. Their faces were the same as always, but their counsel was no longer idle. Avoid the high trails, they said. Follow the river more than the ridge, set no traps where the salmon hang. We debated then, beneath the damp needles, whether to press upriver where the Chinook pointed, or to skirt the country and seek a crossing. The men were seasoned pride, and trade demanded pelts. Practical caution and a matter of common sense for survival argued retreat. I sat with my journal on my knees and wrote each mark and sound as if by recording it I might lay it to rest. Yet we packed at dawn with measured hands, for the thing in the cedars had not shown itself directly to be slain or driven away. It had only left its evidence and a feeling that the forest watched our small company as one watches an insect upon a warm stone. We moved on, following the river's bend, keeping our eyes aloft and our hands near our weapons, the memory of a falling salmon and the sound of high branches breaking following us like a shadow. The day narrowed into the next dusk, and with each mile the timber closed in further, and the unanswered questions closed with it. One morning we found trap snares cut cleanly and a line of prints pressed deep in the loam, nearly 18 inches from heel to toe, and set wider than any bear I had measured. We marked them with a twig and paced the stride twice. A coil of our pack straps lay shredded, and a tuft of coarse dark hair, coarser than an elk's, caught on a wire at night. A low, hollow calling answered our watch like the groan of a distant cedar. The accumulation of damage and sound made the notion of a common predator harder to bear. The morning light filtered thin through fir and cedar, and the camp moved in the slow economy of men who had traded at Fort Vancouver and now measured what remained: flour, salt pork, a keg of lead, a roll of trade cloth. We ate sparingly, wrapped our bedding tight against the damp, and examined the marks with tools of our trade: a knife, a bent bit of iron, a pocket compass. I set the twig across the print for scale and paced that stride twice as one paces a furlong. The distance between steps suggested a creature whose gait carried weight outward. Not the inward roll of a Bruin's pass, but the long, balanced step of something taller than any bear I had known. We mended the snares with what remained of our cordage, working over a small brazier to soften leather thongs and twist spare wire. The The coil of pack straps looked as if some deliberate hand had clipped it, rather than teeth gnawing in haste. The cut was neat. The hair on the wire was coarse, almost bristling to the touch, dark as old pitch and thicker than the pelage of elk. We passed it around as men will pass a curious coin, each drawing his own small, speechless inference. Cole, whose hands were worn from hauling otter skins at the river, swore softly and laid his palm flat upon the tuft as if to count its honesty. We doubled the watches. I kept one of the first shifts, Cole beside me, 2 muskets within arms. Reach, a long Kentish flintlock and a percussion rifle, and a pair of pistols for close work. We tended a low fire and measured the night by the slow drip from boughs. When the call lifted, it was a sound neither wholly animal nor wholly wind. A low, resonant moan that set the hair along my forearm on edge, like the voice of some vast cedar being split by frost. Cole hummed under his breath to keep his throat from tightening. There was the habitual stiffening in each man's shoulders, the way men of long travel learn to make their bodies withstand what the mind will not. At midday, we followed the prints upstream. They led us to a narrow tributary to the Columbia, a bed of black mud and sharp-stoned shallows where the bank rose in alder and moss. There the prints deepened as if the creature had paused, and we found a drag line that suggested a burden borne. Splintered reed, the rind of a small tree, the mark of something long and cumbersome. The trail stopped at a rocky shelf. On the stone were fresh scrapes and the damp iron smell of churned earth. We took bearings with a pocket compass, set a rudimentary course, and left 2 men with the horses and what little remained of our stores. As the afternoon waned, the forest closed upon us. The light went the color of old green glass. We moved with rifles at the ready, searching trunks and shadowed hollows. We found no den, no carcass, only evidence. Twigs broken at shoulder height, a tuft of that same dark hair snagged upon a thorn, scuffs as if great feet had brushed moss aside. The men spoke in low tones then, recalling names and tales heard at Fort Vancouver from Chinook and Iroquois hunters, names we did not use aloud among ourselves. The prints and the calls did not answer to trade law, they answered only to observation. When dusk fell, we turned back, each man thinking of the river and the next Hudson's Bay Road. The watches were doubled again, and we took stock by lamplight. Measurements of the prints, the time, the men who had stood with me. I slept fitfully, waking to that hollow call rolling through the timber as if some distant keel was shoving through fog. We had put ourselves upon its trail and could not pretend otherwise. The path ahead lay along the river. The question was not whether we would see it again, but what mark it would make upon our small party when it did. I was on the first watch when a hulking silhouette slid between 2 trunks, taller than any man on his knees, and moving with a gait that put its feet where no biped should be. Its eyes caught the firelight and gleamed like coal, and it made a knocking sound against wood that set our teeth on edge. We were 3 men and 2 pack mules in that ring of cedar and smoke. The remainder of our party already turned to bed on blankets and pelts, the kettles cold. I had my percussion rifle across my knees, cap box near at hand, and the night was close with mist from the river. The knocking came again, slow, deliberate. 2 taps, a pause, 3, and the sound did not belong to woodpecker nor elk. It was heavy, as if a fist with a hard knuckle rapped the living trunk. I spoke into the dark. Felix, who kept the next watch, answered with a hiss. We whispered names, orders that had been drilled along the Columbia and at Fort Vancouver. Wake the sentry, set more light to the fire, take the rifle. The rifle cracked once when Felix, hands steady because fear is a practical thing, fired a round into the space where the thing had showed itself. The report was a hard punctuation. The thing answered with a long, breath-like moan, a sound like a bellows with a broken seam, and the smell of rotten salmon rolled through the fire smoke and made us gag. We found scrapes along the outer trunk of cedar where its arms had raked, deep furrows that stripped bark and left the white heart exposed. The earth around the fire bore the impression of feet that did not square with the prints I had known on trapping trails. Long, flattened depressions, as though something heavy had stepped and then slid. The mules shied, and one stamped its heel. There was sputtering of oil from the lamp as Eldridge knocked it over, and for a moment the flames guttered. We shoved more wood on, and the little light made the night nearer. Felix went to fetch a knife and a lantern. He came back with something clutched in his hand, tufts of coarse hair matted with slime and a pungent reek. It smelled of river rot and old runs of salmon. We laid the lock of hair on a blanket and examined it by the lamp. Dark as coal at the root, lighter at the ends, and thicker than any bear's I had handled. We stripped our hats and rubbed our brows and counted our cartridges. There were 4 of us who could wake and fight if need be. The others slept as men do when their bodies are as weary as their fears. We set a watch rope of rawhide about the char and rigged a pit of small sharpened stakes where the thing had pressed itself. It was an invention birthed of half-sleep and full alarm. One must keep sensible hands in such hours. I checked the caps, felt the barrels, and when the distant knock struck a 4th time, close now around the western buttress of cedars, Eldridge let loose a volley. The thing gave that same moaning note and retreated, the salmon stench sweeping through our ranks, and at morning we counted the costs. 1 mule was gone. Its halter lay cut and trampled where we had left it overnight. Its load, 2 great bundles of beaver skins destined for Fort Vancouver, had been dragged into the alder and then abandoned, the pelts torn and scattered. The canvas of a supply chest was slashed. Tracks led to the river and then disappeared into the shallows as if the thing had sunk itself out of sight. I followed them with both the company guide and my senses and found old reddened stones. Where salmon had spawned beside those stones lay a smear of something that dried to the color of iron and stank of the same rancid fish. We held a council at first. Light. No man wanted to risk the main party in such a place. The map in my pack bore the annotations of our route from Fort Vancouver, latitudes and provisions, and across that paper the decision lay plain: press on with fewer stores or return for reinforcements. We could not tarry to debate longer. The forest had announced itself as sentinel and thief. We rewound the rope, wrapped the remaining pelts tighter, and lashed 2 spare muskets across the leading mules. Felix would not look back. Eldridge kept his hand near his knife. As we broke camp, the trees to our rear answered with a long, hollow tapping that might have been a farewell or a summons. I set my face toward the interior, toward the cowlets and the high ridges beyond. But the knowledge of those scrapes and the smell of rotten salmon clung to my clothing. When night fell again, we made a tighter circle, posting men farther from fire and from the river. That knocking continued at intervals, now from our flank, now from the high cedar above. Each time it came, we were upon our rifles in an instant. The country took on a new ledger of fear. Where before it had been a landscape of beaver and trade, it was now a place that remembered us. I write this by better light and steadier hand, with our lead mules farther downriver and one man less in our count. The trail ahead is uncertain, and the thing that moves where it ought not has shown us how little we know of those cedared hollows. We shall go on at dawn. We cannot leave the pelts to rot. My last sight of the place was a pair of coal-bright eyes in the dark, and beyond them, the slow, deliberate rubbing of hands on a trunk. 2 long marks that will remain in my memory as proof that something watched us leave. At first light, we struck the camp, leaving 2 packs and a wounded pride behind. The air was cold, and the cedar needles still glistened with last night's mist. I remember the slow mechanical checks, tasting the powder to be sure it had not damped, bisecting cartridges with a steadied thumb, feeling the leather of a moccasin sole that a man had patched with string in the dark, and the way our breath drew straight lines into the pale air as if accusing us of haste. One of the company, Calloway, would not follow us into the high cedars that morning. He stood by the smoking pit with hands empty, eyes fixed on the tree line where the tracks had vanished, and then he turned his back on the river and walked inland without another word. We watched him go a full minute before one of us spoke, but none of us could in honesty say we expected to see him again. He was not seen again. The others muttered oaths that the cedar country now held more than wolves and bears, and they swore never to return to Alder Hollow. We made deliberate crossings of the Lewis River, the men balancing packs and riding poles across fallen logs, the current a cold insistence against boots and oars. Our progress was measured in the small practical acts that had saved us more than once. Sanding a blunted bayonet at the fireside, retying a jerkin that had been ripped when we scrambled over a slide, rationing pemmican and hardtack until the way to Fort Vancouver measured only days instead of weeks. I kept the torn pages of my journal in a leather roll, the ink smeared by rain and by a hand that had trembled while writing. The entries were scant and abrupt, where the events had pressed most close. I wrapped the roll about my chest beneath my coat, for there are things a man carries that he must never show the light until he has cause. When we reached Fort Vancouver, we found the gate at its usual hour, the Hudson's Bay men slow to rise, but quick to listen when danger might mean lost pelts. We laid the journals upon the table of the clerk, and showed the torn sheets and the inked notation of the strange prints. Long impressions between the pads, clustered in a way no trapper I spoke to could reconcile with any known foot. I watched the clerk lift an eyebrow and run his finger along the margin where the Lewis River was drawn in faded ink. He made, in a deliberate hand, a small mark and wrote beneath it a name we had not yet given. Stalker's Bend. The name looked absurd and solemn at once upon the map, as if a simple label might lay the thing like a trap across paper. Word moved among canoe and campfire more readily than any official ledger. Men who had once laughed at our tales lowered their voices and shared stories of missing hounds, of distant fires snuffed in the night, of fresh hides found torn and unworn. They came with their own small evidence. 2 ruled photographs were not yet common inland, so they brought knives and moccasins, a splintered paddle, prints traced in flour on a board. Faces hardened with the knowledge that some tracks on the frontier were not those of wolves, and that we had seen what none of us could name with conviction. In the months after, I returned to my ink and to the business of counting furs, but sleep no longer came without music underneath it. The wet scrape of something moving through cedar, a long inhalation that might have been breath or wind. We lost more than our packs on that journey. We lost the careless unbelief that makes a man think nature always answers in ways he can understand. Calloway's name was crossed from the muster roll. His trade goods were divided among the men. The fort made ready rifles and brass-headed bolts for any who would escort a party to the bend, but few volunteered. Alder Hollow kept its hush, and Stalker's Bend kept its Newling notation on the chart beside the Lewis. Years passed and stories gained edges, but the torn journals remained where I had left them, a folded truth that would not be eased into legend. The Stalker, whatever manner of thing it was, remained an unanswered presence on our charts and in our sleep, and the map beside the Lewis River carried a warning no man pretended to read without lowering his voice.